Revision of the lifestyles of phytoceid mites and implications for biological control strategies. This is one of my favorite reports regarding predatory mites because in the aspect of biological control, there are a ton of predatory mites, and a lot of people don't know more than a few, and even people who know more than a few might not know all of the different qualities and aspects associated with them, their physiology, the environments that they do best on. This sort of thing is invaluable. This information is invaluable for people who are trying to use predatory mites the most effectively. And this report is a revision of an older report that came out in 1997. Let me read you the abstract. A new classification of lifestyles of phytoceid mites is proposed based on the findings and suggestions of many studies conducted in the 15 years since the publication of the lifestyle system by McMurtry and Croft. In this newly proposed classification, Type 1 is divided into 3 subtypes to highlight mite prey specificity. Type 1A, specialized predators of Tetronychus species. Subtype 1B, specialized predators of web nest producing mites. Subtype 1C, specialized predators of tidioids, and that's all the subtypes for type 1. Type 1A, 1B, and 1C. And they're all specialized for mites. They don't eat anything else but mites, and these mites eat plant material. Type 2, selective predators of tetranychid mites. So they're essentially the same, but essentially these are mites that will eat tetranychid species, but they will also go after pollen in some cases, or sometimes they will go after other genera of tetranychids. Type 3 is generalist predators. Type 3 is a huge and diverse group of general feeders. Predators in this category are now grouped into 5 subtypes based on the microhabitat occupied and morphology. And essentially we have subtype 3A, which are predators living on pubescent or hairy leaves. 3B, generalist predators living on glabrous or smooth leaves. 3C, generalist predators living in confined spaces on dicotyledonous plants. And 3D, which are predators living in confined monocotyledonous plants. And 3E, generalist predators from soil and litter habitats. And finally we have type 4, which are the pollen-feeding generalist predators. And this also remains essentially the same. 2 possible additional lifestyles include phytoceans living on aquatic plants and phytoceans able to pierce leaf cells. Behavioral and biological information is updated and implications for biological control strategies are discussed. That's pretty dense, but essentially it goes like this. Type 1 are mites that will only eat mites that eat plants. Why is that important? It's important because these sorts of mites are harder to rear in general, so that will affect their cost. And you might think, well, what does cost have to do with it? Well, commercially, obviously, for those who might think that cost is quite a big deal, you already know, biocontrol can be kind of expensive sometimes. And for people who haven't used biocontrol, they might be a little bit wary, and they'll be even more wary if the mites cost quite a bit of money. Additionally, these sorts of mites are just simply harder to rear, so they're just going to be more expensive even for people who are trying to use them effectively. It might incentivize somebody to use less, which might not be the best choice, but it's the most economic choice, and in some cases it's the only choice for people who can't spend a lot of money on their treatment options. Type 2 and Type 3 and Type 4, in fact, so every other type except for Type 1, is able to feed on mites that are not just tetranychid mites. In some cases, this includes pollen. For Type 2 mites, they might be able to eat pollen and maybe other tetranychid species. But they might not be able to feed on pollen exclusively, and they might not be able to feed on pollen for long periods of time without any other kind of prey. So they are much more, they are kind of like their type 1 cousins, but they are less devoted to mites only. They are not carnivores always. Type 3 are the generalists, and type 4 are pollen-feeding generalists. And the big difference between these two is that type 4 is able to eat pollen exclusively. Pollen is a big part of their diet, and they're usually able to reach a large amount of different kinds of insect and mite families. So this might include, whitefly larvae, thrips larvae, but also areophyid larvae, which are russet mites, tarsinemids like broad mites. So type 4 are the broad spectrum predatory mite. And unlike a broad spectrum pesticide, they're not going to have a systemic ingress into the plant. They're not going to be, translaminar and things like that. But they are generalists, and they might not be as ferocious for tetronychids. So if you're dealing with two-spotted spider mite, Tetronychus urticae, then you might want to go for the Persimilus mite, for example, which is a type 1 mite. But if you are looking for a sort of broad spectrum protective group, you might supplement that with type 4 mite, depending on your environment. And type 3 mites are generalist predators as well, but they have been divided into subtypes that essentially mean they might be able to be on smooth or hairy or different kinds of habitats. So if you're growing crops that are hairy and you want to use a certain predatory mite, make sure that it is able to live well on those leaves. If they're not able to live on those leaves, then you will have an ineffective biocontrol, and it might be a waste of resources to use that particular species. But again, sometimes you're forced to because it's the only species available, or it's the most economic, or any other kind of factors. Everyone's growing condition is different, and so understanding nuance will help people use mites for a more novel or clever fashion that might actually yield a better result than the more traditional way of using the mites. It just depends on your environment. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, however. I'm going to skip the introduction because the introduction I gave pretty much explains all of that. Table 1 is just a comparison between type 1 or the types 1 through 4 from the old McMurtry and Croft and the new system that we're going over now. There's no reason to go over this much. We already kind of covered it in my introduction. But it's good to use this table. You can pause this table and look at it. You can also, I've included this document in the video so that people can read it, and they can also get a link in the description. I will leave the name of this report, and I will try to find a link that works, and I will put it in the description for other people to try to get access to it. Type 1 lifestyle specialized mite predators. Again, subtype 1A, specialized predators of Tetronychus, and that usually refers to predators that are effective against those that produce this CWU type. CW stands for complex web. It is sort of it's kind of like a type of web, like spiders make different kinds of webs. Some are orb weavers. Some use their silk to make dens. Some use their silk to hunt. Some don't use their silk except for weaving their egg sacs. Everything is different. In this case, spider mites have different kinds of webs depending on their species or their family. And in this case, these subtypes are good against the Tetronychus urticae kind of CW type web morphology. They don't go over a lot of this information, and I'm not going to go over a lot of that information, but there are reports out there, and if you ask me, I'll help you find them regarding this sort of web type morphology. It's actually kind of interesting and nuanced. Moving on, we've got subtype 1b, specialized predators of web nest producing mites, Tetronychidae. So instead of just Tetronychus, we have just web nest producing mites. So that means Schizotetronychus, that means Stigmaeopsis, that means Oligonychus here. We have web nest types, and this subtype will go after all kinds of web nest producing mites, not just the kinds mostly associated with Tetronychus species. Subtype 1c, specialized predators of tidioids. So if you have species that are tidioids, then you can use these mites. Moving on, we have type 2, lifestyle selective predators of tetranychid mites. This category includes selective predators of tetranychid mites, most often associated with dense web-producing species. We've already mentioned some of these, Oligonychus and Tetranychus. It also includes species of Neosilius, Gallindromus, and Rickeri, and Typhlodromus. So the targets are Tetranychus and Oligonychus species, but they can also go after pollen. They can feed on pollen as well as a supplemental foodstuff, which makes them able to be used in situations where supplemental pollen may be applied, or if the crop makes a lot of pollen, like I said, then they can survive on that pollen and they can be a preventative measure. Whereas a predatory mite that is solely based on mites that eat plants, you can't establish them in the same way. You have to make sure that they have food, otherwise they'll die, and that's a waste of resources. So again, know your mites. If you have any questions regarding these mites, which mites are best for which situation, this is kind of my job. This is sort of the kind of thing that I like to help people out with. So if you ever have a question, feel free to contact me. Leave a comment below. I'll try to help you as best as I can, because this sort of stuff can be confusing. So I know that it was hard for me learning all of this information, and I still have more to learn always. So feel free to mention something if it's not clear or if it's new, because this video might become old and outdated, who knows. And if that happens, I'll have to make another video explaining the differences, and I'll be happy to do that too. Moving on from here, we have type 3 lifestyle, which are generalist predators. The introduction says species in this category feed and reproduce on a wide range of prey. And they say at least under laboratory conditions, which is pretty true. Sometimes mites or other organisms will have an adaptive diet, which is not very realistic to expect in nature. Where they're from, where they're introduced, where they are native, they might have developed something in their evolutionary history, or they just might find that another pest has a similar characteristic which signals this is food, but they might not be good at eating that food. They might not be a good biocontrol agent, maybe because they don't reproduce fast enough, or they don't consume all stages of the life cycle. They might just eat eggs. They might just eat adults. They might not eat pupa. Just depends. And if that's the case, then those mites will be less effective. They have to be a good biocontrol, they have to do two things. They have to reduce the population better than it reproduces, and they have to reproduce better than that population. Ideally, they have both of those traits. If they have one or the other, they can still be good, but having both of those traits, including a sort of narrow target that doesn't affect non-pest species. If it affects another pest species, if it can be a suppressant, then that's always great. But normally you want something that will be a narrow band and won't affect native organisms that are not pests. Moving on from here, we have subtype 3A, generalist predators living on pubescent leaves. Remember, all of the generalists and subtypes for 3, so subtypes A, B, C, D, and E, all 5, they are basically subdivided into their microhabitat. In this case, hairy or pubescent leaves. Subtype 3B are generalist predators living on smooth or glabrous leaves. And on type 3C, we have dicotyledonous plants, and 3D are monocotyledonous plants, and 3E are generalist predators from the soil and litter habitats. So these are all different microhabitats. The first 4 is foliage. The last one is soil and litter. And some predatory mites will retreat into that area, into the rhizosphere kinda, or the top of the soil sphere. And they do this for a number of reasons. Maybe the humidity is better, maybe it's too hot or it's too dry, or it's more humid rather, so they're attracted to that humidity if it's too dry for them. There's a bunch of different reasons. And that's basically the type 3 generalist predators. They can affect many different kinds of species, and they can feed even better on pollen than the type 2s can. Type 4. Pollen-feeding generalist predators. These are the most, these are probably the most broad spectrum that you can find for predatory mites. They feed on pollen very well. It says here, this category contains phytoceid predators for which pollen constitute an important part of their diet. And that's helpful because that means that something like supplemental pollen might be more effective. It might also be more necessary in some cases, perhaps. If you have crops that don't have any pollen or you're not exposed to pollen, then there's no ambient pollen, then you might consider that as an option, perhaps. It depends on your growing situation, whether that's even worth the money to spend, because that can be somewhat expensive in some cases, and if you don't know how to properly apply it, it can be unhelpful in some cases, and certainly sort of a waste of resources again. It says here that these species generally have high reproductive capacity when feeding on pollen, and population increases often follow blossoming periods of the crop or adjacent plants. Floriculture, flowers that make a lot of pollen, pepper plants, other plants that make pollen, obviously things like corn, they have wind pollination. There's obviously, for supplemental pollen, there's typha, which are cattails. Cattail pollen is something that they can eat, but also keep in mind that a lot of mites in type 4 and some of them in type 3, they might feed on thrips, and a lot of thrips feed on pollen. So some cases you have thrips already feeding on your pollen, and so to put in these mites would be effective because they'll both be drawn to the same place. Moving on from here, we have the possible additional types they mentioned in the introduction. They're not totally sure on these two groups, but I'll go over them anyways, because the latter of the two is sort of interesting to note. So we have aquatic phytoseids. So this is a pretty small group, but it seems like there is some evolutionary development that might allow for aquatic or semi-aquatic behavior. And this is probably something that's a little bit more esoteric and probably not very helpful or related to people who are using these mites in biocontrol, at least for now. Again, things can change. Some new species may be found, discovered, and reared to affect maybe pests that live in agricultural rice crops, where they use rice paddies, or they might be helpful in getting rid of mosquitoes. Who knows? Although I doubt that on the larvae for mosquitoes, they're pretty fast. Phytoseids with plant cell piercing abilities is the latter group, and I'm going to just read the first two paragraphs here. Cross-type was suggested by Adar to contain phytoseids that apparently complement their nutrition requirements by feeding on leaf cells. Now remember, this is how spider mites feed, like tetranychids. So there are some other biocontrol organisms, certain predatory plant bugs have been known to feed on stem and leaf tissue cells. But whether or not they do a lot of damage, they do most of their damage against the pest that they're released for. But of course, some people might scoff and say that if they do attack your plants, then there's a possibility for even greater damage, but that's usually not the case. I don't know any example where that is the case. They don't usually eat plants. That's just a supplemental part of their diet. Although evidence suggests their ability to pierce leaf cells, the primary reason for this type of behavior is still unknown, given that the limiting factor for any organism is usually the availability of water. It seems that leaf cell piercing may be related to water uptake, the uptake of nutrients being a consequence of their presence in the imbibed liquid. So that's sort of the theory, or that's sort of the, not really theory, but the understanding for these plant bugs. They're just supplementing their diet with some plant nutrients. It's kind of like how in the human diet, you don't necessarily have to eat meat every day. Certainly humans evolved to be omnivorous, and there are advantages to omnivory, and the same advantages that humans have, we have a wide selection of possible foodstuffs, is true for these predatory mites. But if some of them do consume more than just pollen, they actually do consume some of the plant, it's a small price to pay, usually, for other treatment options. And here we have an example. Uptake of liquid in the third paragraph. Uptake of liquid by phytoseid mites was first reported by Chant from laboratory experiments with, I don't really know the genus, but E. finlandicus, Typhlodomus rhenanus, and I assume Typhlodomus pyri. So it's something that's been observed, but is it seen in all species? Perhaps not. For example, a very popular Amblysseus swirskyii was evaluated for this ability to consume the liquid in citrus leaf cells. And it looks like the latter of these two, E. scatalis and Amblysseus swirskyii, the latter, which was swirskyii, was not able to pierce the leaf, but it did ingest free water on the surface of substrate, which I assume was the leaf. So not always is the reporting realistic. Like what we said before, sometimes there are mites that will consume certain organisms under laboratory conditions, under forced feeding conditions, but they're not realistically expected to control those pests species or those other species. They're not necessarily going to be very effective against, they're not going to do that in the wild, in nature. They might not just come across it. Same thing here. It's possible that a lot of these organisms might feed on plant liquids if they are already wounded or damaged in some fashion, or if there's already liquid on the plant, they might be not piercing but just feeding on water that's just left over from like morning dew or water or rain or something like this. So sometimes this sort of information can be lacking and require much more further study, but it's interesting to consider. And that's really it. There are some conclusions here that are made, but pretty much all of the conclusions that I made in this document have a reference to this. I just want to go over and say that, again, the beauty of this classification system is particularly found in the type 1 and the type 4 groups, in my opinion, and the type 2 to a degree. Type 1 are mites that will go after Tetranicus, your two-spotted spider mite, your McDaniel mite, your red tomato spider mite. These are all mites that these species will be good at taking care of. Usually, they make dense webs, the spider mites do, and these ones take care of that. Some type 2 can also do this as well, and but they can also feed on pollen, which allows them to be used in sachets. It allows them to be reared more effectively, which means they might be cheaper. Type 4 are also able to be reared on many different kinds of organisms, and that gives them the advantage of being able to use in sachets and to be able to be cultivated much more effectively. And that's about it, honestly. I hope this was informational and educational. I hope that you learned something. I hope that it was helpful. If there's anything that was unclear, if you want me to go over something in depth in the future, send me a message, post a comment, do whatever you need to do. Share this with somebody if you think that they need to go over this report. Maybe my narration will be able to explain why it's helpful for some people to know these different predatory mite types. Additionally, if you have any questions, I'm always available to help out. I like to make sure that people understand this because it's really free information, and I'll leave a link to the report in the description so that you can go over it at your own speed and with your own detail, and maybe that will make some parts more clear.